So let me introduce today's speaker to you. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Andrew Briggs from Oxford. He's a Professor of Nanomaterials, I think is the official...
Correct, that means small stuff.
Thank you. So Andrew has degrees in both physics and theology and has studied in both Oxford and Cambridge. He's been Professor of Nanomaterials since 2002, and his scientific research is concentrated on materials with the potential for building quantum computers. And he has the privilege of publishing, I think, well over 500 papers, research papers and books and articles on that subject. He's also well involved with the Templeton World Charity Foundation and has been responsible for helping to prepare and evaluate their grant proposals for the past 7 or 8 years now, I think. In 2016, Andrew published a book together with Roger Wagner entitled The Penultimate Curiosity, How Science Swims in the Slipstream of Ultimate Questions. And there are copies of that book available on the bookstore at the back. And it's also got a DVD and study guide and been sliced into a number of smaller books for children. And I'm sure Andrew will be delighted to tell you all about that afterwards. And they're also available on the bookstore. More recently, he's published this book, It Keeps Me Seeking, The Invitation from Science, Philosophy and Religion. And I'll wave a copy in front of you now. And it is the title of that, It Keeps Me Seeking, that forms the basis for Andrew's talk to us today. So you're very welcome with us, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much indeed, Keith. Thanks for your welcome today. The AV is more precarious than I've ever known AV to be, so nobody breathe until the end of the talk, or it may stop working. This is a picture called Writing in the Dust by Roger Wagner, and a detail from that picture forms the cover of It Keeps Me Seeking, and I'll come back to that towards the end. You can think of the world that we inhabit as being like a house. And we live in this house, and we're curious people. We love measuring things, so we want to measure the length and the width of the rooms and the height of the ceilings. If, like me, you're a materials scientist, you want to know what it's made of, so you're interested in the material of the floor and the wall of the ceilings. You might be interested in how the wiring works and how the plumbing works, especially when it doesn't work. And if you're in the social sciences, you might be interested to study how people interact in the house. How do they use the different rooms? Which rooms are more private and which rooms are more public? And you could go on and on, learning more and more about the house and having a wonderful time studying it and understanding it better. Until one day you notice that the house has got windows. And you can look out through the windows and see a marvelous world beyond, and as it were be called to that world beyond, and open the windows and let the sunshine in, and on a day warmer than today, let the breezes in. And what I find in my science, and many of my colleagues find, is that this material world that we study in our laboratory calls us to something beyond itself, something transcendent. It might be poetry or music or art. In a few cases, it even leads to faith in God. This is from Anthony Flou's book, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind, and he identifies 3 dimensions of nature that science spotlights that pointed him to God and made him change his mind about God. In It Keeps Me Seeking, one of the themes that we have is that God is a being to be known, not a hypothesis to be tested. And now at this point, I'm afraid the gremlins have got the better of this PowerPoint presentation, so please excuse the typography going akimbo. But when I say something like that, the emphasis is on to be known. The emphasis is on a relationship with God that we can explore There used to be, in ancient times, two theories of how vision works. One was that something went from the eye out to what you were looking at. It was called extramission. And the other one was that something came from what you're looking at into your eye. It was called intramission. And of course, we now accept the intramission theory, which was, I think, probably first established by a Muslim scholar, towards the end of the first millennium. And engaging with God is like intramission. It's not us coming up with an idea of God and then testing whether or not that God exists, because such an idea of a God whose existence could be postulated and tested simply isn't a description of God worth having. So you don't make up an idea of what you think God should be like and then seek to prove whether or not he exists. Rather, it's an engagement with reality, saying, what can we discover? And that's why God has a name. And that's why he is, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His name is as it were, the fullest meaning there is of the verb to be. And the description of God is therefore inseparable from the history of those who share their experiences of God. Now, when I say that the material world is like a house with windows that call us out to something beyond the house, I think that becomes apparent when you look at some of the big questions we could ask in life. Here's a list from Gregory in The Unintended Reformation. What should I live for and why? What should I believe and why should I believe it? What is morality and where does it come from? What sort of person should I be? What's meaningful in life? What should I do to lead a fulfilling life? What is it that makes life worth living? And we're undertaking a project now with the Templeton team in Oxford on promoting human flourishing through the best of scientific insight and spiritual wisdom. And we were seeking to identify a topic that we could focus on where changes were taking place that will be so significant that they will affect the application of established answers, or indeed may call for fresh approaches to be developed. So again, I apologize for the bad typography, but the general area of the project is promoting flourishing, human flourishing, through the best of scientific insight and spiritual wisdom. And here are some changes that we see taking place that are going to affect human flourishing. And on this list, I want to focus today on two that are specifically enabled by advances in science. There are two changes that are taking place in technology that have the potential for a very big impact on human flourishing and that are enabled by underpinning science. So the first of those that I'll talk about is machine learning, and then I'll talk about gene synthesis. And you'll see, as we look at them, that underpinning all the big questions about them is, what does it mean to be human? And what does it mean for a human to flourish? So the first one is machine learning. And the way that we're doing it in my laboratory is all based on Bayesian probability. And there's the maths of Bayesian probability for those of you who are familiar with conditional probability. And there's a picture which might or might not be Thomas Bayes. It's the one that's generally associated with him, but nobody knows whether it's the right one. And the principle of Bayesian optimization is very simple. Suppose that I have a belief that something is true, but there's some uncertainty in my belief, and I want to reduce the uncertainty. The way that I'm going to do that is to acquire more data, but the data are costly to acquire, and so I want to make an optimal choice of which next data would do me the most good in increasing the accuracy and confidence of my belief. And the belief could be about anything that's got uncertainty in it. For example, what's going to happen on the 29th of March. But it could be a belief about a mathematical formula that describes some widget in our laboratory that we're measuring. And so Bayesian optimization in the laboratory proceeds like this. I'm going to assume that we've got a mathematical function that describes our device that's a function of only one variable. In practice, it'll be a function of many, many variables, but it's harder to draw those on a PowerPoint slide. And this is what we think the function is, so that's our prior belief. But there's uncertainty. That's a measure of the uncertainty there. And so what we do in our cycle is we say, which next data point would do us the most good in improving our belief? And we do that actually by finding the maximum in what's called an acquisition function, or sometimes an information gain, which I haven't plotted here. But let's suppose here the maximum in the acquisition function occurs about there. Then we say that's where I must make, sorry for those in the front cheap seats that can't see, but I daren't move the computer, I really daren't. So it says, all right, we'll make the next measurement there. Now we've got a data point. Now we've reduced the uncertainty there. Now we make a new search for the maximum in what's now the acquisition function, and the next maximum might be here. So now we go around and we acquire another data point, and we narrow down the possibilities. Now that's the cartoon of the principle. This is how we actually do it in the lab. So first of all, I should say we do some training. We train the machine on prior data, both experimental data and simulations of our device. And we then make an initial scan, we make some reconstructions, we have a predicted information gain, and then we make the next measurement. So here you see us actually going through this cycle. So initially on this, in this case it's two variables and the brightness is the current. We measure 64 points. And on the basis of that, we make a number of reconstructions, and crucially, we feed some uncertainty into the reconstructions so that they're not all the same. And then what the machine does, and I'm going to simplify this, but it gives you an approximate picture, is it says, where do the different candidate reconstructions differ most? Because that's where you'll learn the most. And from that, we calculate an information gain. So you see, in these white patches here, they're all more or less the same, so it doesn't matter if you make a measurement there, you will not learn very much. But if we make a measure in these colored bits, then we gain some information and make progress. So here is an actual experiment running. So in our lab, the experiment is run by the machine, and the machine decides what the next measurement should be. And it's better at it than a graduate student is. That's the key point, okay? So here it's made an initial 64 measurements. And now this is the acquisition map. Where it's already got a measurement, it's black, because obviously you won't learn anything if you've already made the measurement there. And what you'll see as we run it is that we make some the machine makes some measurements, and as it makes some measurements, it begins to fill this in, and correspondingly, the information gain, the acquisition map, changes to show it where the next measurement should be. So here we go. Okay, there it's making the measurements on the left, and it's updating the acquisition map on the right as we go along. And just to give you an illustration of how well this works, an experiment that for a new graduate student would take a few weeks, for an experienced one could do it maybe in a few days, maybe in less than a week. By last summer, the machine was doing it in 9 minutes, and now it can do it in 6 minutes. So this is the kind of science that's now being enabled. Of course, machine learning has many, many more applications. You're all either beneficiaries of or victims of machine learning, depending on your attitude to Google and Amazon and so on. But believe me, you know, it's there. So now you can begin to ask some questions, all right? As these machines advance, can a machine make a scientific discovery? Can it manifest properties like agency, imagination, creativity, belief, surprise, curiosity? That's not a random list. There's actually a great deal to be said about each of those properties and the extent to which a machine might be able to study them. And there have been some important reports about machine learning. The Royal Society brought one out 2 years ago. The House of Lords Select Committee brought one out last year. And now there's an important council that's been set up for data and automated decision making. So you can begin to think, what will machine learning affect in our lives? It'll certainly affect transportation. It'll affect employment. It'll affect healthcare. It'll affect care of the elderly. And I think the likelihood is that it will affect the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Each of those could be negative, but I don't want to focus on the negative. Actually, I think each of those could be positive if we address them carefully and think ahead. And I'll come back to that later. So what are the challenges and opportunities of machine learning? Well, should the technologies be embraced? That's the sort of question that politicians and policymakers will think about. Is redemption for humans only? Kind of question this forum might think about. I don't know, how many of you know the children's book, Will My Rabbit Go to Heaven? Very obvious question for a, 5-year-old to ask, okay? Will my robot go to heaven? How extensive is the redemption of the world and all that's in it? And then it comes back to what does it mean to be a human? Is this life all? What gives life my meaning? What are humans for? We'll come back to that. So now the second topic, which is gene synthesis. And I got into this because in the lab we make a lot of measurements of individual molecules. We use the sort of material that Colin Humphrey's company makes, Paragraph, graphene, and we can look at the graphene with atomic resolution, see the graphene edges. We can even determine from a picture like this whether or not the edges are hydrogen terminated. And with our graphene devices, we can control and study quantum effects. So that's an experiment that investigates a Fano resonance in a graphene nanojunction. We can measure the thermopower of one molecule inserted in a gap about 2 nanometers wide between 2 graphene electrodes. We can even study how the flow of electricity, 1 electron at a time, interacts with quantum vibrational modes of the molecule. And this ability to manipulate and study and measure molecules one by one is related to the kind of technology that's now being developed for gene synthesis. This morning I was at a company called Evenetics, just to the south of Cambridge, who probably will soon have the world's most powerful technology for synthesizing long sequences of DNA. And the key to their technology is fantastically accurate control of individual elements of a chip. And I should say fantastically accurate control of the temperature of those elements. And by controlling the temperature, they can take a strand that's already there that's protected by a cap and thermally select whether that cap is removed, and therefore select whether or not that particular one will react with a reagent that comes along, and so they can go on building up the process. And this very precise thermal control is key to the next step, which is what you're going to do is you've made 2 strands here and you want this one to attach to that one. So thermally, you select this one to be desorbed and come along to attach to that. It's true in materials science that the really interesting things are the defects. It's certainly true of humans that you're not going to be able to make human interactions work if you haven't got some mechanism for fault-tolerant error correction. Between humans, it's called forgiveness. And it's also true of gene synthesis that you're never going to get it perfect. And the precise thermal control enables you to exploit the fact that if it's defective, it will melt, it will come apart at a slightly lower temperature than a perfect sequence. And therefore, if you control the temperature accurately, you can discriminate between the ones that have worked and the ones that have got a defect, and thereby, through a rather clever binary process, go on to build extensive strands of defect-free DNA. Now, there have been various reports on this. There's a list of 5 of them. You may notice that the first one and the last one are both from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. Many of those reports distinguish between doing gene, in that case gene editing, because the gene synthesis is a bit newer, for healing disease, and which by and large, you know, the reports are in favor of with certain safety engineering in place, and gene editing, and I'm now talking about gene synthesis for enhancement, which by and large people are much more wary of. So what ethical principles are going to be applied? Well, some quite well-established ones are the principles of biomedical ethics, principles of autonomy, that the individual should make his or her own choice, of beneficence, act in the best interest in the patients, non-beneficence, do no harm, and justice. And that most recent Nuffield one, for instance, concentrates on numbers 2 and 4 of that list. But you'll see already this isn't quite going to work for gene synthesis, is it? Because it's rather hard to think how an unborn, indeed an unconceived child, can make his or her own choice about whether or not to be born of gene synthesis. So this is already going to need a bit more thinking. So what might gene synthesis offer? It might offer choice in conception. So the traditional route of sex for conception offers the benign wisdom and the unfathomable cruelty of nature, with risks that are going to become, I think, analogous to the risks of saying, well, I'm not going to immunize my children. Not quite the same, so there are subtle differences, and I hope to provoke some discussion about that. But it will certainly offer a new route of synthesis, increased probability of longer, healthier, and more successful life, but then with a risk that the children, if they don't enjoy what they've been optimized for, or they might see themselves as a sort of consumer product that their parents have chosen. And you might think that, you know, just as we know how to do GM of other kinds of life for performance, how might we genetically engineer humans for physical performance or artistic performance or even intellectual performance? Science fiction at the moment, but it's amazing how fast the technology is progressing. One way to catch the public imagination about this, because whatever position you're coming from, like so many other things, notably climate change at the minute, whatever your convictions about the science and the ethics, change is only going to happen if you can sweep up plenty of people with you who share your objectives, even though they may have arrived at them for different reasons. And a good way to catch the public imagination is to talk about state-sponsored genetically modified athletes, you see. So you could ask whether we've actually seen the last Olympic Games in which there weren't any genetically modified athletes. Who knows? How would you detect it? And if you did detect it, who would be to blame if the engineering was done before the athlete was born? And would there be an argument that the subject's autonomy had been undermined? Well, one of the things that causes great stir in the papers each year is the admission statistics for Oxford and Cambridge. I'm afraid usually with the most appalling abuse of probability theory. either because the journalists don't understand it or they willfully misrepresent it for the purpose of selling copies. But supposing that in the years to come we understood enough about the extraordinarily complex relationship between the genome and academic ability that you could, offer a service to parents that would enhance their offspring's probability of getting into an elite university. Imagine how many you'd have queuing up for your services. I like this study that came out in Nature a year ago about why the brain evolved, and they basically divided the motivations into me versus nature, sort of ecological ones, and ones for human cooperation. And I think it used to be the consensus, and maybe still is, that the extraordinarily costly enlargement of the human brain was primarily driven by social interactions. This study came to a different conclusion, which is that if you look at that top one there for Homo sapiens, they're saying that 60% of the motivation came from challenges of working with practical things in the environment. Making spears, hunting animals, food, and so on, which if you're a nerd like me who likes making things in the laboratory is very encouraging, you see. And only 40% they're saying was because of various kinds of social interactions. Now, let's just focus on the nerd side of intelligence for a moment. And what seems to be the case is that there's a very strong correlation between different kinds of measures that you could make of intellectual intelligence. So this was a Project Talent study that was looking at spatial intelligence, mathematical intelligence, and verbal intelligence. And they found that they sort of concentrated in this ellipsoid-shaped thing, and that if you took one parameter just along the diagonal of that cube, along the principal axis, and extracted a number which they gave the letter G to, you got a pretty good correlation with SAT tests. And then they compared that with a longitudinal study of people tested in childhood using SAT and then surveyed in middle age. This was people who'd been selected for exceptional ability, so they were in the top 1%, roughly corresponding in the UK to kids who'd get into Oxford or Cambridge. And then they were taking the top quintile of that lot, which is a sort of 1 in 10,000 person. They found that they were 5 times more likely to have a patent, 18 times more likely to have a doctorate in a STEM subject, and 8 times more likely to have STEM tenure at an elite university. So, these motivations of gene synthesis for higher intelligence is the sort of thing that people might one day try to do when we understand it better. Not there yet, but now's a good time to think about it in advance. So the challenges and opportunities of synthetic biology, should you cure a single point gene defect? Well, that's already approved for FDA trials in the USA. Should you do it for an individual? That's what it's approved for. Should you do it for a germline? That's not approved. What, of course, in the UK is approved for the germline is clinical trials of mitochondrial transfer, which is a process that's designed to eliminate the passing on of a mitochondrial disease to a child. In that case, that will be passed on to the germline. Should you use GM to enhance performance for crops? Well, the answer to that would differ according to which side of the Atlantic you're on. But what about for humans? So again, this comes back to the question that's underpinning all this, is what does it mean for a human to flourish? What gives my life meaning? What are humans for? What makes life worthwhile? And so now, just to bring together both the AI and the gene synthesis, now is the time to be thinking about these things. We have our neighbour on one side of our house at Oxford is Paul Collier, Sir Paul Collier. very distinguished economist, who has the ear of many African governments. He, when he came to dinner a few weeks ago, had just come back from Malawi, where he'd been giving to the president of Malawi what he calls ignorable advice. I love the term. Under Lake Malawi, considerably rich deposits have been discovered. And the question is whether or not to exploit them. And Paul's advice is wait 25 years before exploiting them, because wherever in Africa rich mineral resources have been exploited without first having good governance in place, it has led to disaster and bloodshed and tears and unhappiness. And Malawi does not yet have the governance in place that would enable them to bring prosperity and human benefit from exploiting the resources. Can we apply those same principles to these new technologies that will come along, enabled by AI, enabled by gene synthesis, and you can apply it to others as well? So that we say, let us first put, as it were, the governance in place that will mean that these rich resources, which is what I think they are, will be used for benefit and not to cause tears and unhappiness and bloodshed. So what does it mean to be me? And this is a topic of a whole series of Faraday seminars. But let me just touch on one aspect which we touch on in It Keeps Me Seeking, which is that to me means to be responsible. And I talk a little bit in It Keeps Me Seeking. We allowed, most of it's written by all three of us, but we each allowed ourselves one chapter to talk about a sort of personal perspective. And one of the things that comes out in my personal perspective is the way, at aged about 11 years old, actually walking along the cliffs of Norfolk near Sheringham, I found myself trying to think, what does free will mean? I loved science. I was gripped by science. I was confident that science could explain everything, including how the mind works. And I thought, what place does that give for free will? I still don't know the answer to that question. I've read more about it. I'm sort of confused at a deeper level, if you like. I don't know which things I was responsible for, what the influences were of parents and teachers and youth leaders and friends and so on. Probably more than I thought at the time. I think that responsibility is a clearer and crisper and sharper focused concept. I was once corresponding with a very distinguished quantum theorist in Innsbruck called Hans Briggs. And at one point in the correspondence, I wrote to him and said, Hans, I don't think I do have to choose, but if I did have to choose between my confidence that quantum theory is right and my confidence that I am responsible for choices that I've made, I would choose responsibility. And he wrote back and said, Dear Andrew, that is a very strong statement. We'd better discuss it over dinner. And now, a year and a half later, we did discuss it over dinner. But if you were trying to explain these sort of concepts, 3,000 years ago or whatever, how would you do it to people who didn't know quantum theory, didn't know relativity, didn't know modern neuroscience, didn't even know about Darwinian evolution and the refinements that have followed his original theory? But they love stories. So you might tell a story, and you might set it in a garden if they like gardens, and you might talk about the creation of man and how it's not good for man to be alone, and how animals form sort of companions, but only partially satisfactory, and the real companionship came through the creation of the woman. Would that be a complete story? Would you stop there? What you would have left out is this concept of responsibility and what happens when trust is breached And in the continuation of that story, you might want to make a statement about responsibility and to people for whom God was part of their life. You might want to extend that responsibility to accountability to God. And you might even want to make a distinction that the humans are accountable to God in a way that non-humans are not. And then if you go back to what may have been written afterwards, as a sort of preface to the whole thing, you get this lovely description of all the different bits that you need for the world being made, in a way that seems to echo descriptions of the way that temples were made, with a strong emphasis not on form but on function. What are things for? And what's the whole temple for? It's in order that God can be not remote on a mountain but involved with his people in the city where they are. And so the whole purpose of it is for the temple to be finished and for God to enjoy being with his people. That's why the story of the creation of the world has this refrain, and God looked and it was tov, fit for purpose is a good translation. And then the whole point was the seventh day, the quality time with his people. Not put your feet up and have a cup of tea because you're exhausted, but this is what it's all for. And in that context, when thinking about the creation of man, the metaphor that might come to mind is the metaphor of a statue, tselem in Hebrew, that an emperor or ruler would put in a far corner of the kingdom where they weren't often able to visit in person, to remind people there who was in charge, and to remind people about issues of responsibility and accountability. So right there in the Tselem, God made man in his own image, you have this concept of responsibility. So maybe that's an element of what it means to be human and what humans are for. Now I mentioned earlier on that we're developing this project on promoting human flourishing through the best of scientific insight and spiritual wisdom. And through quite a detailed process, we're going to produce a report which will be published about a year from now. And we wanted to focus on one topic that people could grab hold of and would do something about. And the topic we've focused on is what new kinds of citizenship will be needed in an age of automated decision-making and networking. So you can see how that responds to a big change that's happening. It responds to an issue that hardly needs me to emphasize, that we're not very good at decision-making as citizens at the moment. And it also emphasizes that this nature of the citizen, both as an individual citizen and as one in a community, because you can't be a citizen in isolation. It emphasizes both the privileges and the responsibility of a citizen. And Nora Neil's point that, it's all very well to have a universal declaration of human rights, but every right needs a duty. So you need a universal declaration of human duties. And the citizen has both privileges and responsibilities. And also a citizen comes from a city, all right, which is a locus both of interaction, because you interact with the people you live with in the city, and of identity. I am a Roman. I am a Cambridge citizen, all right? And both of those are undergoing change faster than we can blink at the moment. So they need fresh approaches to look at them. And all of it is underpinned by what does it mean to be human? What does it mean for a human citizen to flourish? In the material dimension, in the relational dimension, but, and this comes back to my metaphor of a house, also in the transcendent dimension, without which any flourishing is impoverished. So I can flash up on the screen as we're coming to a close, just some of the things that we're identifying in this project. I'd love to engage with anyone here who's interested. On the left-hand column is some of the changes that we see taking place that affect citizenship. And on the right-hand side is the kind of thing that we think we're going to have to address in this report as a way of, addressing those changes that are taking place on the left-hand side. Let me come back to the book. The book is written with Hans Halvorsen, who is a professor of philosophy at Princeton University. It's very good for us scientists to have to work with a philosopher, because philosophy has its own high standards. And one of the themes of the book is that we set a high bar on what counts as a valid argument. And Andrew Steen, only after we'd taken this picture of the three of us talking about the book, did a friend, actually it was Roger Wagner, who supplied the picture for the cover, point out that if you look at the poses of the three heads in that picture, they correspond to the title page of Galileo's Discourses with Aristotle, Ptolemy and Copernicus. Entirely unintentional coincidence. If you ever listen to Something Understood on Radio 4 on Sundays, either before you've got up or after you've gone to bed, on the 17th of February, less than 2 weeks from now, it will be a program where Mark Tully is interviewing me about these sort of topics that I'm talking about today. So let me come back to the book, and the final, that is the cover of it. And this is the picture by Roger from which the cover is taken. You may recognize the scene. As so often in his paintings, Roger uses modern technology to bring the stories that we know from the literature into the technological age in which we live our lives. For example, if you can look at the original, which hangs in Auckland Castle, in the phone there, his attention to detail is amazing, because in the top right-hand corner, there's the tree that is casting that shadow. And in some Bibles, this story might be given a title such as The Woman Taken in Adultery. Roger calls it The Men Taken in Hypocrisy. And the reason we chose that is that often in a context like the one today, people are talking about miracles. Colin's written a whole book on it. And why do we sort of think so much? Well, the miracles aren't what we expect. They're different from what we expect to happen. That's why they're surprising, and we stop and think about them. We ought to be no less surprised by Jesus' moral teaching, which is just as unexpected as the miracles. And maybe the reason we're not more surprised by it is because we're the inheritors of the tradition that's derived from it. So there you have it. It keeps me seeking. You can see I'm raising more questions than I'm answering, because it does keep me seeking.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Did you say that raised lots of questions? I'm sure there's plenty here amongst us, and we've got 10 minutes or so to address them. Who would like to start the seeking? Here we are down the front. We'll just wait for Steph to come with a microphone.
Hello, is this on? Oh, just
Yeah.
now, yeah. Yes, there was a thing on the radio this morning where children are arriving at primary school without verbal skills, because they're not sharing, round a table for a meal at home and the traditional things that kids did. And they did all sorts of longitudinal studies to show that for each sort of deficiency in verbal skills, if a child can't actually describe that she's wearing what dress she's wearing, or what sort of activity she's doing or something, then it makes a huge difference massive difference in all sorts of things, from employment possibilities to mental health in later stage. And the solution was to get them all speaking together before you did any learning or reading learning. And so, we could have asked loads of things on your topic, but it struck me that this business of the social interaction of people being unaware of their responsibilities, taking the responsibilities but doing it unconsciously, might be something that's valid.
Well, I'm only half listening to what you're saying, so I'm really just networking with my friends on Facebook. You don't mind that, do you? In Chile now, they've stopped having red and green men to tell you when you can cross the street. They have a bar in the pavement just as you get to the street, because all the Santiago citizens are looking like that. They're not looking across the street. Of course, you're right. One of the aspects of the citizenship in a network age is to pay attention to both speech content and speech actions. So by speech content, I mean the printed content. Okay, is it true? You know, is it offensive? All those things. By speech actions, I mean that it's me saying it. It's the difference between an academic and a politician. You see, the academic, when you tell him, says something, thinks, I wonder if that's true. The politician, when you tell him something, says, I wonder why he told me that. So I think that we're going to have to pay attention to all these things. There's one other thing that I'd say from what you said. The reason you talked about it is because you care. You want to enhance these kids' social skills. You want to enhance their interpersonal skills and so on. And you probably want to enhance those skills using all the tools at your disposal. And I think a question we're going to have to face is that when other tools become available to us, how are we going to make use of them?
There's a question over here.
Thank you. Yes, your description of some of the possible potentials for gene editing of humans sounds to me like it could make the Third Reich's eugenics look like a tea party. Would you agree?
That's why we need to be thinking about it now. That's why we need good governance in place, and whether that's political governance or ethical governance or, you know, society's governance. How it's going to happen, I don't know. I think it's a very hard question, actually. But we need to put it in place in order that we can harvest these analogy of natural resources in a way that will be beneficial, because it won't happen by itself.
Do you think we've opened Pandora's box that can never be closed on that? Because no matter what governance we have, there will always be somebody who thinks that they know better.
I think that's why it's so urgent. I think that we've been saved with that, with some of the technologies of mass destruction, saved from that by the sheer cost of the infrastructure necessary, centrifuges for purifying, you know, nuclear weapon material, the fab lines needed for big chips, though not the infrastructure required for a teenager in their bedroom to make malicious software. So we've already seen that, all right? And think of what the cost is of coping with malicious software, because it's cheap to make. At the moment, no teenager in their bedroom has the software for gene synthesis. Who knows whether or when that might change? It might not be an expensive technology.
Certainly with some of the technologies now, it does seem as though an amateur in their garage can do quite a bit of gene editing.
Yeah.
That's a bit of hype, but I think we're getting there.
Yeah.
There's a question just here.
Thank you. I was interested in seeking is what keeps a lot of people interested, I guess, in all this science and religion. At the end of the day, it is all interesting, but will there be an end to seeking? Surely as we seek more and more, the horizon gets further away.
Well, people debate that in science. There's a very nice piece by Martin Rees, you know, looking at just that question. I see no end to science discovery. I think it's getting more and more exciting, more and more fields. Nor do I see any end to discovering the transcendental dimension. I see it as a pathway of endless joyful discovery.
There's a question just behind you there.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. And I just wanted to point out about this idea of keep seeking and our human exploration versus the idea of God's transcendence and limitlessness in his knowledge and in his being. And I think you can have both. So we can keep seeking and never truly reach him because he's beyond us. And we have to be careful at the cost that we pay. But on an up note, I would just to say that God's infinite mercy takes into account both our desire to seek knowledge and the danger that we could do with it since the fall. So famously, in the last bit of the telling of the fall in Genesis, he does say that he's put an angel to guard the tree of life.
Yes.
So we might not actually be able to synthesize life, and that wouldn't be a bad thing. It would be to our own safeguarding.
I'm so glad you've commented. I'd like others to pick up on this. The whole point about seeking is that I'm not a sort of repository of answers, you know. And there are lots of other people in this room who are very knowledgeable about some of the topics I've touched on. I'd love their views. I see people in the room who know about theology and psychology and know about genes and so on. I'd love your views.
I don't know if that's an answer or a question, but there's a hand at the back there.
I hope to get to the end of it to work that one out. No, I've just been thinking about gene synthesis, and I just think about the, taking it as far as it goes, and this lady's already mentioned, creating humans. And my thought was, what would be the difference between that and an organic robot? But then I thought, well, actually, we're not going to get that far. If you read Revelation, there will be the mark of the beast, which personally I think is going to be an implanted chip in the forehead.
Will it have 666?
Not sure why you laugh. People are doing it already.
Yeah.
An implanted chip in the forehead, which is, it doesn't say implanted chip, it says the mark of the beast on the forehead.
Yeah.
And I think we're developing towards that. So I don't know if that's a question or
That's
a point.
That's a comment, it's a contribution. I'd love some other contributions. People who've thought about these things and got views.
I can't profess to have thought about it very much, but just one thing that arose to me from what you were saying about gene synthesis is you showed that slide where of the success outcomes of those who say we're in the top 10, 1 in 10,000.
Yes.
I wondered if there was a flip side to that, the number of those who end up with mental health problems or in the gutter because they're not adjusted to society for which they're an outlier by a very far degree, and whether optimizing a human being might be actually making an average human being in terms of their overall well-being and contribution to society. If you're in a way, society is formed by the majority who are broadly average and is the best adjusted person when you take into account their social, emotional, etc. well-being. Is it best to be average? I don't suppose many parents would pay to have an average child, but is that what's best for humanity?
I think you're getting at the heart of the question. I think if I can just give a sideways comment on that on the machine learning side. I think machine learning, but the same might be true of gene synthesis depending on how it's distributed and how it's applied. I think the machine learning has a greater capacity than any technology we've ever known before to create a gap between the haves and the have-nots. I think the haves will be the people who, like me, contribute to it, or others who understand it and know how to make use of it. And the have-nots will be the people who don't, or might even lose their jobs, have their jobs displaced by the machines. And this is another of these issues that we need to address, in my view, now, so that we have thought about it and we have things in place to ensure that won't happen before it comes along, not trying to pick up the pieces afterwards.
I'll take one last question, I think, just across there.
Thank you for the talk. So I'm studying the Old Testament now, but I'm not sure I can be an expert or anything, but I've been reminded of the Tower of Babel, that God saying that it's not good for man to be able to do everything that he puts his mind to. Yes. So perhaps that's a response as well to the cherubim with the sword. Yeah. But I was wondering about the idea of accountability, responsibility. When you have people in this world now like Assad, the very rich who exploit the poor, who we see no end to the goodness that they get in their lives versus the people that they exploit. How do we then challenge them with this idea of accountability to God and to each other, actually? That's, how do we even convince them?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that's the final comment and I don't have to answer it, because I think I think you've put your finger on the right question. I think it needs a concerted effort to think how to address it. You've certainly got to start where they are, otherwise you'll just leave them behind,
Thank you. And on that point, I think we'll draw things to a close. But thank you, Andrew, for stimulating us and starting us on that journey of seeking and questioning. It's been fascinating. Thank you very much.